I recently ran into an extended analogy that shows preborn babies arguing about the existence of their mother to illustrate how smart faith is and how stupid skepticism is. There are many versions of this that I've seen passed around for years, and there's a good chance you may have run into it before. Now, I find it absolutely disgusting in its insinuations about atheists and in the blatantly dishonest shortcuts it uses to make its point. However, the fact that it was posted to Facebook by a dear family member gives me mixed feelings. On one hand, I hate being so critical about something shared by someone I care about. But on the other, the fact that the same person was taken in by something so manipulative just makes me that much more upset with the author. This is a good reminder that as an atheist, you might see your loved ones pass along things that strike you as stupid and offensive. But they're at least partly victims of other people's rhetorical strategies, and there's a difference between someone who falls for something, even if, yes, they probably should have thought a little harder about it, and the original person who sat down and deliberately crafted its deceptive message. Try to remember that when you run into stuff like this, and make sure to be gracious with those you care about. Anyway, here's the story. I'm going to let the entire thing unfold before giving my thoughts and then sharing my own version of the narrative that, while a satire I guess, much more accurately reflects what would happen in the situation. To differentiate the sound of the story from my commentary, I've asked my friend Andy Fellows to read it for me. He's an awesome and charismatic YouTuber who you'd be lucky to stumble upon, so please go check him out and subscribe. That said, here's the story.
In a mother's womb were two babies. One asked the other, "Do you believe in life after delivery?" The other replied, "Why, of course. There has to be something after delivery. Maybe we're here to prepare ourselves for what will be later." "Nonsense," said the first. "There is no life after delivery. What kind of life would that be?" "I don't know, but there'll be more light than here. Maybe we'll walk with our legs and eat from our mouths. Maybe we'll have other senses that we can't understand now." The first replied, "That is absurd. Walking is impossible. And eating with our mouths? Ridiculous. The umbilical cord supplies nutrition and everything we need. But the umbilical cord is so short. Life after delivery is to be logically excluded." The second insisted, "Well, I think there is something, and maybe it's different than it is here. Maybe we won't need this physical cord anymore." The first replied, "Nonsense. And, moreover, if there is life, then why has nobody ever come back from there? Delivery is the end of life. And in the after delivery, there is nothing but darkness and silence and oblivion. It takes us nowhere." "Well, I don't know," said the second. "But certainly we will meet Mother, and she will take care of us." The first replied, "Mother? You actually believe in Mother?" That's laughable, isn't it? If Mother exists, where is she now? The second said, "She is all around us. We are surrounded by her. We are of her. It is in her that we live. Without her, this world would not and could not exist." The first said, "Well, I don't see her, so it's only logical she doesn't exist." To which the second replied, "Sometimes, when you're in silence and you focus and listen, you can perceive her presence, and you can hear her loving voice calling down from above." Maybe this was one of the best explanations of the concept of God, and this lovely parable is from Your Sacred Self by Dr. Wayne Dyer.
I think the point is pretty obvious. Most Christian readers will walk away with the impression that the first baby was dumb, or at least short-sighted, because it just assumed that there was nothing outside the womb. As readers, we have the benefit of knowing a lot of things these babies don't, so it sounds silly to hear one of them say that the womb is the only place that exists, that it doesn't believe in the outside world, and that the birthing process, which we know is but a mechanism for moving babies out of the womb and onto further stages of development, is the obvious end of existence. By contrast, the second baby is supposed to be relatively intelligent, because it has a faith that leaves it open to more possibilities, and because of this it ends up being right. But here's the question. How did the second baby end up being right? That's the key, isn't it? See, there's no plausible way for it to know what the writer shows it knowing. Instead of giving any depiction of how faith served to make the baby so dead on right about what's in the outside world, the author just takes his own pre-existing knowledge of the world, which he himself learned through observation and not faith, by the way, and just places it into the mouth of the character he wishes to vindicate. Since we as readers know things these characters don't, the second baby sounds smart for having faith, even though it really wasn't and the author cheated by importing outside information, while the first sounds dumb for rejecting what looks obvious from the outside. This would be like me writing a series of stories called The World's Smartest Detective, where every case is solved by a guy with no training who just walks into the room and immediately blurts out the name of the murderer. Even though the character is always correct, his method of solving crimes is dumb. He would almost always be horrifyingly wrong in the real world, and he's only correct in stories because I cheated and gave him the right answers in spite of his methodology. The story of the two babies is just as meaningless for all the same reasons. But regardless, his audience cheers because a stand-in for Christians ended up being right and a stand-in for atheism ended up being wrong, which just shows how little they demand from any author willing to depict this outcome. Of course, a Christian might say that, even if it's unlikely the baby would nail all the details that precisely, its general openness to possibilities made it more likely correct than the first baby, who so stubbornly rejected the very possibility of anything it couldn't see. This is what might lead people to fall back to some fuzzy sense that this is still a legitimate analogy, even if they recognize the baby's conclusions were a little overly specific. The second baby was still showing more of a high-functioning recognition of possibilities. And really, even if you can't observe it, it's almost certain that there's something else out there, right? But this just shows where the story gets a little more nuanced in its deception, for a few reasons. First, we have to acknowledge the fact that the initial setup of the story alters our perception even on this point. We're being shown two characters in a situation that we know is small, temporary, and insignificant compared to the outside world and the much longer life they will live after birth. So not only does dramatic irony make one character more right than it should be, but it makes another character seem more closed-minded than it really is. But is this character really as dumb as we think? Or does it just seem that way because we start off being shown things it is not? This is further exacerbated by a second strategy, one the story hinges on more than you might realize. We recognize that the first baby is deliberately written to sound like a smug, arrogant, and overly dismissive jackass, because that's just how charitable most Christians are in their portrayal of atheists or atheist-like characters. But notice how conclusive this character is in all his statements about life after the womb. Instead of expressing any reasonable, hesitant doubt about the second baby's claims, which could have sounded perfectly reasonable even in this context, it just blurts out snooty and instantly dismissive things like, "Life after delivery is to be logically excluded," or, "Well, I don't see her, so it is only logical that she doesn't exist." Take statements like these, which really don't represent the mindset, language, or conclusions of any reasonable atheist, and apply them to a situation where we have outside knowledge of how wrong the character is, and you've successfully planted insinuations about atheists into the minds of Christians that will take a long time to dislodge. And that was probably the author's main objective. Finally, this story thrives in fuzzy territory between two things. On one hand, a vague sentiment that there might be something out there, and on the other, unjustifiably precise claims about what that something is. It draws from the apparent credibility and open-mindedness of the first sentiment, like I said, maybe disavowing how specifically on the nose the second baby's guesses were, and while it pretends to be camped there, it's ultimately making insinuations about really specific conclusions. Because Christians don't just want acknowledgement of something beyond our observation. They want that something to be a specific God from a specific culture seen through the lens of a specific theology. So if they themselves want to make unjustifiably specific guesses about what's out there, then they should own how unjustifiably specific the baby was being in its guesses. But what would really happen if a baby used faith to decide what was outside the womb? And how would any reasonably written skeptical character respond to these claims? To explore these questions, I've written an alternative parable which doesn't manipulate its audience by being stupid on purpose. Again, this is read by my friend Andy, and if you want the story in writing, you can find it posted to my Facebook and Twitter accounts. Enjoy.
In a mother's womb, there were two babies. One asked the other, "Do you believe in life after delivery?" The other replied, "Why, of course. There has to be something more." "Really?" asked the first. "But how do you know there has to be anything after delivery? And what do you think it would look like?" The second said, "I don't know. But the amniotic fluid will be much sweeter out there. Maybe we'll be able to swim much faster, and we'll have an umbilical cord that's twice as thick and lets in lots more nutrition. And who knows, maybe there will be different kinds of creatures, like babies with 2 faces and 5 arms and eyes on all sides of their head. I bet whatever it is will be beyond our imagination. The first replied. Well, I don't see any reason to believe in any of that. And it sounds like you're just making things up based on what you see around us. Why do you think that stuff exists? The second insisted, well, I'm not sure, but I think there has to be something more. And maybe it's different than it is here. The first thought about this for a moment, and instead of just blurting out nonsense and then jumping to conclusions like an overly dismissive asshole atheist stereotype who was obviously written by a Christian, replied, I guess we can't know there's nothing out there, but we also have no good reason to conclude that there is anything out there, much less start deciding what it is. Shouldn't we wait to see evidence for what is or isn't out there instead of just making wild guesses? Well, I don't know, said the second. But certainly, after delivery, we will be greeted by the giant perfect baby who made all of this. The first replied, the giant perfect baby? Why do you think such a thing exists? He didn't call the idea laughable because, again, he wasn't a caricature written by spiteful Christians. The second said, because where else did all this come from? I mean, obviously, the giant perfect baby made everything. On the first day, it made the womb. On the second day, it separated amniotic fluid from amniotic fluid. On the third, it made the placenta and the umbilical cord, each after its own kind. And on the fourth day, it made us in its own image. In the image of itself, it created us. Twin and twin, it created us. Unless, the second scoffed, you believe the theory that life randomly arose when sperm and egg united and we just happened to evolve from tiny clumps of cells to beings as complex as us. He then cackled like Kent Hovland at the very thought, because if Christians can throw in mean-spirited details, why can't I get away with it just once? Said the first, well, I don't see such a baby, so while I wouldn't say so it is only logical that it doesn't exist, like somebody trying to strawman my position, I have no reason to think it exists. And honestly, the whole idea sounds so made up that I feel justified in setting it aside and ignoring it until you bring me some evidence. You want evidence? Replied the second. Then just try being still and listening. Sometimes when you focus and listen, you can feel the giant baby speaking to your heart, and you can hear a loving voice calling down from above. And in this case, there was actually an audible voice for them to hear, which is where the analogy about 2 babies clearly departs from a discussion about God. However, the second baby was even wrong about where the voice came from, just like it was wrong about everything else, because that's what happens when you just wildly speculate about things you have no evidence for.
This program was made possible by a grant from S.R. Foxley, Bob Generic, and Q, and by the generous support of viewers like you. If you'd like to join them in pledging to this channel, please find a link to the Prophet of Zod Patreon below.